Hello, everyone, and welcome to a full spectrum survival interview. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Dunagun Kaiser. You all know Dunagun from the Reluctant Preppers YouTube channel, as well as his vast knowledge and vast position to interview leading members of the survival, preparedness, and economic front. He's interviewed people such as G. Edward Griffin, a famous author who's considering the Federal Reserve, David Morgan, of course, Rob Kirby, Daniel McAdams, and more. So, Dunagun, how are you today?
Very good, and thank you for having me here on your show, Brad. It's always been a pleasure to join you and to have you on our channel as well.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of things that are going on in the world. The first thing that I want to kind of hit on is China is testing the United States. The new administration is nearly finished building almost 24 structures in the South China Sea that appear designed and ready to house long-range surface-to-air missiles. So what I see here is an economic disaster waiting to happen. The South China Sea is really the hub. It's the thoroughfare that all of the world's waters go through. Tell me, from your experience and the people that you have talked to, what's the biggest economic threat that could kind of start the world powers to really clamp down and militarize their positions on the earth?
Yeah, the interesting thing when I've probed our experts that I've had on the show, asking them about what should we watch out for and what would be signs or signals of the start of the collapse that so many have talked about. And the fascinating thing about that to me is how wide and varied the possible triggers can be. You're mentioning a credible one, and that is a major event that would disrupt important international supply chain routes. We know that Singapore is one of the busiest and most lucrative shipping route in the world, both for maritime as well as air shipping. And in fact, we have knowledge about some companies that have to route their things through Singapore to be able to transact trade through otherwise politically incompatible buyers and sellers who don't even acknowledge each other's official existence, but they're happy to have the goods and the money flow through Singapore, that kind of thing. So that area of the world is absolutely a nexus and a crossroads for commerce, and that is one example among many that could be pulling the stone out from the bottom of the dam and starting a financial collapse. But one of the things that it points out is the fragility that our modern world has placed upon the just-in-time supply chain principle. The JIT happens idea that you can squeeze non-productive capital out of the supply chain that would be back from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, that would be sitting around in these warehouses of inventory when people used to manufacture build to stock rather than build to order, and instead turn the whole thing around and say you need to pull value through the value chain. As soon as something gets consumed, as soon as a consumer takes something off the shelf in Walmart, that spot on the shelf is emptied out. The night crew sees that and scan that with their scanner, and it pulls the demand signal, traces all the way through and off, half the world away in China, a factory starts making more of that particular item because it just got pulled through the distribution warehouse and through the wholesaler and through the buyer and all the way back to the original manufacturer. So there's no waste. That's the whole thing of a lot of these improvement programs in the supply chain industry is remove all sources of waste, which is non-productive capital. Well, when you remove all non-productive capital from the supply chain, you get it down so that it's got razor thin inventories, basically no inventory. Yeah, there's no margin for error. So the slightest disruption that can really cause not just a single point of failure, but if it can cause a regional disruption, it could send shockwaves through the entire modern supply chain and truly trigger reactive responses on the part of governments worldwide. And that's just one of many kinds of examples that could trigger a lockup of the ability for our modern world to deliver, the goods that people depend on for their life and livelihood.
That's interesting because I had read some white papers from universities in the US where they discussed the just-in-time delivery system, but they word it differently. What they were discussing was the small curveballs, the small hiccups that can happen, such as an increase in gas price, an increase in diesel price. And if given enough time, that one change can snowball all the way through the market till you have retail outlets that don't have the items on the shelf just because of that one change. And that's a change that can happen at any point. So look at something else that could happen, on a larger or more grand scale, something like a regional disaster, a large earthquake, even bigger. You think of things like geopolitical strife and war. These types of things would stop the goods that we each consider somewhat necessary for daily sustenance in life from coming to the store. And I think overnight here in the US, you could have a Venezuela where it was almost within just a couple of days to a couple of weeks, it went from a somewhat flourishing retail outlet, an avenue where people could go and get their goods, including their, bread, milk, medicines, things like that, to now people eating out of trash cans. So from the people that you have talked to, is there a real likelihood that we could face something like that, given the fact that we don't know what exactly might ignite that fire?
Yeah, and that's a severe threat. You asked me to reflect on what were the top warnings we've heard from our guests and reluctant preppers, and number one at the top of the list is the risk of a catastrophic economic collapse. And there are so many varied ways that could start. You're right that another one could be any kind of a natural disaster that could trigger that kind of a panic or a disruption.
Right.
The point is that there's so many aspects of the way that we've migrated our system in the nominally it's to optimize it for efficiency and for profit, but what it has actually done is made it just ripe for fragility, brittleness, and it can't tolerate disruptions. For example, the push towards a cashless society means that if you have, and we can talk about that later because there's a huge issue about the cashless society in terms of loss of liberty and privacy, but specifically for this thing about disruption, cash in the hands of distributed throughout the population, it acts as a natural buffer. It's kind of like a sponge that can soak up or release, and people can transact. They can do what they need to do to get by with each other. But if you're completely dependent upon the global economic banking system for your ability to transact, then if anything, such as a natural disaster or whatever might disrupt the electronic communications or whatever, suddenly even though it makes no sense, it's completely illogical. At a local level, you'd have no way of transacting with your people that even could have something that of value to you locally in the way that everybody's accustomed to doing it. Now, taking that a step back, I know you on your channel and when you visited us, we've talked about bartering. We've talked about all kinds of different ways people can have real money, gold and silver in small quantities, et cetera, things of value, barter goods, all sort of things. So that's absolutely the kinds of things you need to think about. But that just the very factor of our dependency on electronic banking and the drive and the pressure for insidious reasons as well, that we're being forced into that, it just increases our vulnerability. Not to mention that we're, as a worldwide population, infinitely more vulnerable to dependency on, you mentioned disruptions to the supply chain, because we don't have local production. We had Joel Salatin from Polyface Farms on 2 weeks ago talking about the local food to the rescue and talking about why it's so robust and resilient for communities to have good relationship networks established locally, production of foods and things that are necessary for life locally, and consumption of that locally. Because again, in the case of a disruption, it doesn't have to impact you nearly as much as if everything that you consume, everything you need, has to come from far away through all these steps of dependency.
Well, you brought up sort of the ill intent that's behind the move to a cashless society, and I think that's very important to talk about. And I think what it's doing, and you might have something else to say about this, but just looking at the facts of moving away from what is now a promise to pay on a sheet of paper. It's not, we all know that it's not worth what it was. But that promise to pay, that $1 bill, does give you something tangible, like you said. And as you move that away, as you remove that from the consumer or the citizen's hands, now they have nothing. So what you've done is created another level of dependency.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what we see happening all over the spectrum of the Western world.
Yeah, there's a couple things I want to make sure and hit on. That is just to make sure that people are crystal clear on the severity of this concept. You've just really got to let this sink into your mind. There are multiple countries in the world already who have outlawed, including the United States. In the former town we lived in, I went to the bank, and I always, because my son was collecting silver coins, the teller says, "Is there anything else I can do for you?" And I always say, "Yes. Do you have any silver or old coins?"
Right.
And he said, "Nope, I don't have any of those, but I have a 1939 $1,000 bill." And I said, "Sold." And he went ahead and wrote out a counter check I showed him my ID, took the money out of my checking account. I walked home with a $1,000 1939 bill. I said to my wife very proudly, I was walking past, "Look what I got." Showed it to her. She says, "Where'd you get that?" I said, "I got it in the bank. It's amazing. Look at this. Isn't it amazing?" She says, "Get rid of it. Get rid of it." I said, "Why?" She said, it's no good to us. We can't use it. It's no good for anything." I thought, "Oh, come on. At least I can like sell it at a coin shop. It's got to be worth something big." So I called a couple coin stores, and they would barely give me a premium over at this time. It was quite a while ago. But finally, okay, fine. I said, I'll satisfy it. I'll take it back to the bank and just give it back to them. So I took it back to the bank and took it up to the teller, and the teller said, we can't take this." I said, "What are you talking about? We have to report this." I said, "I just got it here like a couple hours ago." And the bank manager came over. "Where did you get this?" "I got it from one of your tellers." And I had to write up this whole report on me on where I got this and why I had it in my possession. And they were going to go in for investigation, send it into the Federal Reserve in Minneapolis, where we were at the time, and have it investigated. Within 5 days, they said I should probably get the credit in my account. So the money was tied up for 5 days. So that was long story to say. The $1,000 bills are verboten, as are the $500 bills. So we know you can still get hundreds at the bank, but those are being discussed as being to be eliminated. And in India, they're eliminating the larger denominations, and in other countries as well. And they can keep driving this down. We all know that the value of even the dollar itself can buy nothing close to where it used to.
That's right.
And that's another whole point to talk about in a different part, is talking about this grinding loss of wealth, the death by 1,000 cuts. But specifically in this area of the cashless society, they are already doing it. It is already happening. They're already taking away the bigger denominations and getting down to where the lesser ones. Basically, it'll be just pocket change, which is really not able to transact significant transactions that you need in life, and making the rest of it all, of course, in the name of law enforcement, all in the name of preventing terrorism and that sort of thing, black markets. But if you really think about it for a moment,
it's a control mechanism.
You cannot hold the fruits of your labor, and that is a violation of natural law. I mean, there is nothing more fundamental to our abilities as persons who labor from the work of our hands to feed ourselves and to feed our family and to better our life position than to be told, "You cannot hold the work of your hands. It will be held in custody for you by the powers that be and the system, and you can come and ask permission to have access to it in the future, but you can never actually hold it in your hand. All it can be do is transfer it into another part of the system, because it doesn't really exist anymore. It's in your world now. It's in the electronic world, and that takes away the ability of the individual to control their life energy and where they want to store that, how they want to handle that, what they want to do with it. So it's not only a loss of ability to have access to the fruits of your labor, it's also the complete loss of privacy about what you choose to do with your well-being as well.
I think that's a really amazing point, in that this is the move that the elite are pushing towards the average citizen of the world. And you look at just a widespread governance over the people, over the you and me in this world. And you look to areas like Japan, where there's just a complete disregard for even the health of the citizens, as the prime minister and as the government right now is pushing people to move back into their radioactive homes near Fukushima. Mm-hmm. And they're doing this with the equivalent of the person moving back into their homes having a chest x-ray, up to 5 chest x-rays per week, just to live in their homes, and they're being forced to. You look at other areas where, like in India, as you mentioned, they discontinued large bills and upset the entire economic arena within the country. And you had some limited riots. You had people waiting out the bank. You had banks saying, no, we're not going to, give you your money. And they did just that. They are using control mechanisms on every front so that you almost don't know where to turn. You don't know what to look for.
Right. And the backdrop that we have to realize is set on this stage is one of unprecedented risk, that it's unlike anything that the world has ever seen. Because when we talk about a catastrophic economic collapse and the potential of that, never before in the history of the world have we had something akin to the derivatives complex that currently exists, that's interlocked and interdependent between all major investment firms, all major banks, and all countries central banks. Every part of the system is tied and dependent on the other ones. I've told the story, and I'll just very briefly touch on it here, how when the 2008 collapse happened and Lehman Brothers went down as the selected victim there, we had funds that had nothing to do with that. We had no accounts at Lehman's or anything. We had this money market cash equivalent account over a completely different brokerage in a different country. And yet we just now in the last quarter this is what 8 years later, got our final letter saying, okay, you've gotten all of the money back that you're going to get from that, because you're not going to get access to it all. It's just gone.
Wow.
But it was locked up for the longest time. And it was collaterally damaged by interdependence with the Lehman's, which we had no idea. When you put your money into a supposedly one-day access money market equivalent fund, you're not being told that on the back end they're investing in it whatever they want and using it to leverage that to the hilt. Also, never in the history of the world has every major country of the world had their money system based on fiat, on debt, rather than on actual gold or some other reserves. And again, we talked about, speaking of debt, never in the history of the world has every level, whether it's from individual families to cities, look at Detroit, look at Los Angeles, look at New York, to states, whether it's California and on, to countries, the nations of the world, been in so much debt. We have countries, whether it's Japan or whether it's Italy or whether it's the US, who are in such a high ratio of debt that more than has ever been before. And you put that on top of that razor thin just-in-time supply chain that we talked about, and the entitlement a conditioned populace that's been weaned off of their self-sufficiency skills and knowledge that their grandparents had, and now they're almost entirely dependent on the this week's paycheck from or my government check, and the entitlement that I get. And when you cause any disruption in that dependent and that fragile of a system, what you can totally get is a overnight lockup of the banking and financial system. And when that happens, we're told that it was within hours of happening back in 2008, and that the situation now, the experts we've had on our channel keep reminding us, in every demonstrable, measurable way, is significantly, not just a little bit, but sometimes order of magnitude worse than what we were at in 2008. And that when that happens again, we're going to see a disruption that's like nothing the world has ever seen. And the fallout from that very likely will be stores, getting sold out right away, and those supply chain failures compounding and escalating, because it gets to be like this snowball where if people aren't getting paid, then they're not going to drive the trucks they can't get the fuel, and then they can't drive the ships, and then they can't, and you start to get where more and more increasing portions of supply chain start failing. And with fuel outages, you rarely, and with supplies stores being stripped clean, you quickly can get panic and looting and riots and chaos. And then comes the trump card, which is curfews and martial law. And you've certainly covered a lot of that on your, like, Jammu and Kashmir and other areas of the world where that gets in. And once you're into curfews and martial law, you have lost any semblance
of freedom.
Semblance of a freedom society, of liberty. And beyond that, it gets worse even there if you just go into real chaos and lawlessness, Mad Max type scenarios.
The funny thing is well, it's not funny, of course, but the interesting aspect is, as we continue to watch the event unfold with the current circulating strains of the avian influenza virus, governments around the world are more concerned with the potential for economic fallout than they're acknowledging the widespread potential for a pandemic that could have up to a 30% mortality rating. So 30% of those that contract this disease could die from it. However, their concern always reflects back to large scale economic upsets and what that will do to the country. And I think that this shows beyond reasonable doubt that the us versus them has widened more and more since the 2008 mini collapse, or still ongoing collapse, than it ever had before that. Do you agree?
Well, and it's not just us versus them; it's the depersonalization of the human person, the devaluing of the human person to be just a
Commodity,
consumer.
right?
Yep, that's absolutely right. Because in a rich, robust society with deep moral roots, you have the recognition of the. I mean, you look at the Constitution of the United States and read through that and decide. Listen to what it talks about: inherent rights that people have, intrinsic rights, and this is the perspective of valuing the entire person, and otherwise, and we've seen that also, and we've had people speak on our show about how we're on the verge of collapse in different ways, militarily or economically, politically, and one of the ways is morally, and in that is evident, abundant evidence of the devaluation and the monetization of the human person, to where instead of having infinite worth and equal worth, now we're just a consumer and a commodity.
Did you happen to catch the Elon Musk talk at the World Government Summit in Dubai?
Did not.
Okay, Elon Musk, of course, the founder and CEO of SolarCity, Tesla, SpaceX, sat there in front of the World Government Summit in Dubai to almost shocked faces, telling them that there was intelligence behind a universal basic income that would come out within the next 10 to 20 years. And this universal basic income, they placated a blame on a strong push to robotics and to replace the human inside the workplace. And this actually falls in line with other things that I've picked up on that show just a widespread change of course from humans doing the work to automation. And I'm sure you're familiar with automation on a large scale. And so what is happening is that now they're starting to game plan that as the human loses that purpose, which has been so long put on their ability to work, that there will be massive depression, disease outbreaks, and a risk to the entire economy at that point. So what they're going to push for is a universal basic income, which you and I both know just doesn't work. Because, you know, after 2008, I think everybody can see that there's nothing that has been fixed. It's just been propped up. And so we keep wedging underneath the broken wall. And so another wedge goes in, breaks down a little bit, another wedge goes in. What are your thoughts on the fact that the 2008 collapse is still ongoing and being just held up by stimulus packages, and B, how a universal basic income and move to automation could really affect the economy?
You bet. So we've had multiple experts on our channel talking about, and we've had, whether it's Andy Hoffman, whether it's others, talking about how the stimulus that was used, I will call it so-called stimulus or attempted stimulus,
Right.
in the form of these bailouts, which of course were always underreported. You know, first it was going to be 400 billion, then it was, oh, okay, it's really 800 billion. Okay, now it's actually just 9 trillion. We did with these credit default swaps, you know, between countries, and it just goes on and up and up from there. First of all, that the bang for the buck that you're getting out of those, another brother John F. is another one we've had on talking about this, that the actual measurable results in the economy, where you could actually point to and say, there, see, we got an increase in labor participation rate, or there, we got an increase in actual goods shipped, or whatever. No,
Right.
it's not happening. It's really much, it's a walking dead. There's that the economies of the world, Japan's been there for like 15 or more years, and
Right.
others are just like these zombie economies, which are being propped up by attempted stimuli, which have to keep being used in increasing formerly ludicrous, not even considered, but like negative interest rates. I mean, if you'd have said those three words together 10 years ago, people would have looked at you like you were from Mars. And now we almost are getting numb to hearing that, because it doesn't, we don't think about how insane it is. That the emperor has no clothes on. In fact, the emperor is, it's like that movie, what is it, Weekend at Bernie's, where this guy is dead and everybody's propping him up just so they can keep acting like the party's still going on.
Right.
And that's part of it, is this increasing need to use increasingly ineffective attempts to prop up what is no longer actually a viable economy. And once you do that, there's a side effect of that propping up, and that is that several of our guests, Bill Murphy from the Gold Antitrust Action Committee and others have been on to talk about how once you, and Bix Weir and others, and Mike Rivero, once you rely so heavily and so deeply intervene in the markets as we have currently with the plunge protection team and the exchange stabilization fund, Rob Kirby talks about that you lose the natural ability of markets to be able to do price discovery and to actually cause the appropriate allocation of capital through true supply and demand and responses to where capital will actually do useful work. Speaking of who's doing the work, if humans aren't doing the work and the capital's not doing the work anymore, you start to break all ties with natural law, and you can only defy natural law for so long before nature will come back in with a vengeance. You also asked about automation displacing workers, and we've certainly seen that cry go up over the past 5 decades from the, actually it's more than that, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But then now the offshoring of labor-intensive manufacturing from the U.S., for example, in Western countries to less expensive or jurisdictions where they have more lax environmental standards, that sort of thing, or where they have very lax labor laws, where you can have sweatshops and child labor and forced labor and that sort of thing, indentured servitude. So basically, it's just modern slavery and modern dumping and basically neo-colonialism that's being perpetrated in the name of efficiency. So that's the ugly side of unbridled, quote-unquote, capitalism, is when you break any sense of moral or decency laws, and you just have a sheer profit being the only thing that's driving you. But you're right that part, again, of the human person is the need to be needed and the virtue of work. I mean, German has an old proverb. It's a folk proverb. Arbeit macht das Leben süß. It means work makes life sweet. That there's a purposefulness to the work of our hands. It's not a burden. It's a gift. It's something you can teach your children, and you can derive a sense of purpose knowing that you're providing specifically. And some people will probably write nasty emails in on this one, but specifically, there can be different gifts that are given to men and women in their natural roles, and men in particular are called to provide and to protect, and women to nurture and to inspire and that sort of thing. So when a man can't knows in his heart that he can no longer provide and protect because the system has
taken that away,
gone against him. Yeah, then you look what happens in our inner cities with the fatherless homes. And in my junior high, half of the attendees there were bussed in from the inner city, and most of them came from fatherless homes. And I heard them talking to each other as I and my friends were talking about what we wanted to do when we grow up. I wanted to become an engineer, and this one wanted to become a doctor, this one whatever, firefighter. Right. And these guys, they wanted, there are two things. They either have to go for become a major sports star or a pimp. Those are the two things. And if they figure they're going to end up in prison, and it's like, what kind of a life do we have to look forward to if you know that the system has conspired against you? Because it does cause despair. You mentioned depression, that sort of thing. If we know that we're the natural work of our hands is not going to bring fruit and allow us to better our lives. So you go ahead.
I think that touches on something really important, and that's that we were meant as human beings to work with our hands. That's how we have survived. We have hunted, and we have kept the watch, and we have toiled in the garden, and we have done all of these things to provide for ourselves and for our families. And that, I think, is the number one thing that is being taken away in our world, is the ability to provide directly for yourself
Right.
and for your family. So it kind of switching gears a little bit, as we see these different things happen and the likelihood of an economic collapse on a massive scale becoming more and more visible. What are your thoughts about what things a person can do just to get started? Where can they just say, okay, I'm ready to start thinking about preparation. Here's what I'm going to do.
Sure. And if I could, one last thing before we go into that, which is a great next step to take, because we're talking about that sense of powerlessness and how do you take it back to your sense of self-determination. That's the right next step to take. Is I wanted to just mention this because you mentioned, as we anticipate the risk of, or the threat of, or the possibility of a massive global collapse. And what I wanted to make sure we say is, we don't have to wait. We don't have to anticipate. We just need to open our eyes and look, because we are already in it today. And we've had Gregory Manarino from traderschoice.net has been on our channel. He's talking about, he says, it's happening around us right now. We are in the middle of it. And I told you I wanted to get back to this death by 1,000 cuts, is we are in the middle of a slow motion train wreck. And the only thing is, we're in the train. And we can, if you just keep your eyes inside, you think, hey, everything seems to be more or less going along okay. But what you don't realize is that this whole thing is crashing around us. Just a few little points for facts for people to think about. Most people realize that if they've paid attention to the value of a dollar, that a dollar doesn't buy what it used to. But are they aware that since the formation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, that the United States dollar has lost already over 98% of its purchasing power, and that the stated policy goal of the Federal Reserve is to keep inflation at a 2% annual rate, which means, by the rule of 72, that every 36 years, your purchasing power, your money would be cut in half again. So that hits you in two ways. One, it's automatic inflation, but theft from any savings account you have. So if you have any money saved up, anything denominated in dollars, that is shrinking at a stated rate of 2% per year. And as they're now starting to raise interest rates, that will accelerate faster than that. And secondly, it impacts, besides your saving, it impacts your wages. So if you're working at a job and if you're a retiree and you're on a pension or fixed income or whatever, you're getting payments, the value of what you're actually getting is being stolen from you because it's being inflated away. And that money is flowing in one direction. It flows away from the people and into the hands of the holders of that debt and the holders of the central banks. Secondly,
that's a good point.
Taxation is creepingly overtaking the fruits of our labor and has been for a long time. When the U.S. Constitution was written, the framers of our country withheld. They voted down the proposition to put into the Constitution that federal taxes could never increase more than 10%. And the reason that was stated why they didn't want to put that in there was because they were afraid that if they put that in there, that they would quickly rise up to that limit. And they didn't. It was unthinkable at that time. But how many, as we do, it's a good time to be talking about taxes, right? This is tax season. Right. As people are, if you do your own taxes, first of all, it's numbingly complex, that nobody really understands the tax code. So again, it takes away your power to even live your own life, the way you're supposed to. You have to hand it over to the experts. Secondly, that year after year after year, and it's generation after generation, there is one direction that taxes really move, and that is in the upward direction. For example, how many people now are subject to AMT, alternative minimum tax? It was never meant to be for the middle class. It was supposed to catch loopholes for the upper 1% back in the 70s when it was put in, and the thing, it wasn't indexed for inflation. So cowardly and by design, it was made so that everybody indexed themselves right up into it. So now the AMT now actually affects over half of taxpayers that are like two-age for earning families or families with large numbers of children. Right. And people have no idea. Also, the Social Security benefits that were originally, if you think about it, like you donate to a 401k or that at your work, you're basically making contributions of your earnings into this tax advantage plan so that in your retirement, you'll be able to draw back the benefits from that. And so Social Security was set up to make sure that people could have a part of their earnings set aside for them so that they would have to increase the robustness and reduce the vulnerability of large amounts of the populace, like we had so many people out of work in the 30s and so on. Right. And instead, the the Congress went ahead and pillaged the Social Security trust funds. That money is gone, and it's going to be bankrupt. And uh, that the tax now, if you look on your pay stub, it actually says FICA tax. They actually put the word tax on there now. It's no longer a contribution you're making because it's just gone. And the U.S. gold reserves being sold off and leased away, and the increases of surveillance, both from, we could go on and on and on, but you don't have to wait for the collapse. The collapse is happening all around you. It's happening in your savings account. It's happening in your wages. It's happening with your earnings being taxed away from you. So that's just to say, it's already upon us. We're in the middle of it right now.
I think that brings up an important part right before we move into personal preparedness, and that's that the waters, the ocean between the government and the citizens that they govern is so deep and so treacherous that anytime a person, a citizen of this earth, wants to deal with the government, they have to take a ride in the boat of a mediator. So to get their taxes done, you go to a tax professional. To go to court, you go to a lawyer. Even as far as healthcare, to get simple
you need a navigator.
Yeah, you need a navigator, exactly. And I think that is that's just another visible semblance of the downward direction that our society is taking.
That's absolutely right. Whenever you remove people's ability to be competent, capable, and able to transact and do the business of their life, provide for themselves, provide for their family, take care of business without the interference, without the supervision of a nanny or a overlord, you take away part of their humanity and definitely their freedom. So what do we do about it? Some real basic steps, and this is the same question. I'm glad you asked it, because it's the same question I ask almost every guest on my channel is, what are the few basic steps? Because it can be so overwhelming. We're really caught between overwhelming despair on the one hand versus kind of normalcy bias and sort of disbelief, and I really can't be that bad, and just shake it off and go back to going with the flow and going with the herd on the other hand. But some basic steps that you can take are, first of all, to remind yourself, who are you? You are a free person. You are made to be free, and you're a person who has intrinsic rights: the right to provide a good living for yourself and your family, the right to your privacy, the right to liberty of your thoughts and your speech, and as long as you're not infringing on the rights of others. So that's first is who am I, and secondly is to remind yourself of some goals that you want to set, to say, I'm going to take steps away from dependency and towards independence. I'm going to take steps that are away from helplessness and towards more empowerment. So just a couple little nuggets. If you go back and think about the things we've talked about, for example, the cashless society. Okay, if they're going to take away my cash, first of all, I'm going to save some up right now to have a cash reserve, a ready cash reserve. Secondly, I'm going to put some of that into some precious metals, whether it's gold or silver. And if you want the ability to be able to barter with that, then smaller denominations is more helpful, and have those as close as you can in possession removes layers of dependency and layers of counterparty risk from your ability to access that in case things go sour. Right. In the case of income, instead of being entirely dependent on your employer or the supply chain or whatever, the more you can diversify different streams of income. Jerry Robinson, we've had on, who's the author of Bankruptcy of Our Nation, talks about in his book by the same name, 21 different streams of income that an ordinary person can just start adding on one at a time. And in fact, he has a very compelling series that he just put out. It's a free podcast on the five stages to personal financial independence, and that's the first one is establishing a ready reserve, like we talked about, and of initially 3 months worth of income for yourself stored up close at hand, and then we're working up from there, and then broadening your streams of income. But then we talked about fragility of the supply chain. So what's the remedy to that? Two big ones. The quick one is having some cache of supplies that are your basic foodstuffs of life, whether it's fresh drinkable water and storable, safe food, emergency food that's available for you. So safe water and safe food storage close at hand.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us here on YouTube. To listen to this interview in its entirety without editing, please consider joining us on Patreon. Here's something that I get asked a lot, and if you say I don't want to touch on it, sure, let's not touch on it. But I get asked a lot about religious and faith-based fatalism. And it's this fatalism aspect where a person, and I'm respectful to all people's religion, and I would rather, no matter what religion a person follows or none at all, if they're a good person, a moral person, then they're welcome to me. So I get asked a lot things like, well, why do I need to prepare? My creator will save the day. And my response to them is, your creator doesn't care whether you see them today or you see them in 80 years. What you do on this earth is really up to you. And that sort of is conflicting with the teachings of almost every religion. What are your thoughts on that kind of faith-based fatalism, and does it affect preparedness?
Well, I think that it's a tricky subject, because anything that I say, I can confess my own belief system, and it's one that I believe is true, but I'm not trying to push that on anybody.
Right.
And so the faith tradition that I belong to explains that grace builds on nature. So it's absolutely true that we live by the grace. This is I'm now confessing my truth.
Sure.
I would say my understanding of the truth, and that is that we live by the grace of God, and we are His creatures. We did not create ourselves, and we're not meant to be the masters of life and death and right and wrong, but we're subject to unchanging laws in those regards. However, we are given the natural abilities to use our intelligence and our strength and our vitality and our cleverness and our wits to survive and to thrive, and to for not just for the purpose of procreation and extending our natural life, but so that in our life here we can learn to love more deeply and to sacrifice for each other, and that sacrificial love will redeem us. And there's no contradiction there. That's an old joke, actually, they taught in church when I was a kid, about the lady in the flood up on the roof of her house and saying, God's going to save me. And the first boat comes and says, you want to come with me? And he says, no, God's going to save me. And the second boat comes and, you want to come with us, lady? We're going to get you out. No, God will save me. And the third boat comes, you can come with us, lady? No, God's going to save me. And so she finally gets drowned in the flood and goes to heaven and says, hey,
why didn't you save me?
Why didn't you save me? So I sent 3 boats. So anyway, the idea that grace builds on nature, that we're given these abilities for a reason, and we can use them wisely and prudently. We're also given wisdom and prudence and the ability to, and you can look, if you're Christian, you can look in the Bible and see tons of examples laid out about where prudence was used to uphold wise people. Look at how Joseph saved Egypt from 7 years of famine and so on through careful preparation, and insight. Right. So anyway, there's plenty of examples like that. But just to say that there's no need for contradiction there. It isn't like either you believe in exercising worldly prudence and judgment, or you believe that God's going to save you. No, it's God.
You were given these tools, right?
You're given these tools for your own good. Don't squander them.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Well, what a perfect way to wrap up the show, and a way to show that we were each born with the tools to survive, and we just need to reclaim many of those, and especially starting with our understanding and our acknowledgement that we are free people on this earth, meant to be here and to live abundant and happy life. So Dunagun from Reluctant Preppers, thank you so much for being here with us. I urge everybody to go on YouTube, go to Reluctant Preppers, just search for it in the YouTube search bar, subscribe to his channel. You're going to get a couple of, I would say you're putting out, a couple of videos every week now?
Usually about 2 a week on average, yeah.
You're going to get good content every single time that isn't of the same repetitive nature that you'll find at other outlets. It's content that will drive you to think and drive you at the end to better prepare yourself. So Dunagun, thank you for being here.
Always an honor. Thank you, Brad.
Thank you everyone for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, fullspectrumsurvival@gmail.com. Keep an eye on Dunagun's channel because I'll be over there. We're going to record an interview the day after this interview is recorded, and I'll be on his channel. So go over there, subscribe, and be ready when it comes out. Thank you guys. As always, stay safe and keep watch.